People often ask me, on those occasions when I get asked to talk at a political rally or whatever it happens to be, what do I think are the greatest challenges confronting us in Australia? I think I probably give three broadly. One is that we no longer understand that you have to have a good debate if you're ever to get good policy. We don't know. But no, Melanie, people often ask me, on those occasions when I get asked to talk at a political rally or whatever it happens to be, what do I think are the greatest challenges confronting us in Australia? I think I probably give three broadly. One is that we no longer understand that you have to have a good debate if you're ever to get good policy. We don't know how to debate. We don't know how to respect one another and treat one another properly to get the best results, negotiate our way forward. Another is that I think so many children now go through an education system that doesn't expose them to a range of views and help them to think rather than respond to their feeling. And another is that I think we have a dad crisis. Now, that's a controversial thing to say, but you, in your description of your journey from leftism to sanity, said that you really struggled with the way that the left, which had always been a fierce defender of family, started to abandon that position. And I don't want to sound insensitive to people who are struggling with this issue in good conscience, and we all know none of us are perfect. Nonetheless, we have to, I think, be prepared to talk honestly about what really works.
For sure.
Now, I wanted to read a little of what you actually said. You talked about some serious work done back in the early 90s by two social scientists, Norman Dennis and George Erdos. Now, according to this report, there was incontrovertible evidence that children in fractured family units tended to die earlier, suffer more ill health, do less well at school, were more likely to be unemployed, more prone to criminal behaviour, and to repeat as adults the same cycle of unstable parenting. Now, it created uproar, as you put it, not just because of what it said, but for who was saying it. The publisher was the Institute of Economic Affairs, seen as right-wing, but the authors were from the left. And indeed, the social science establishment, as you put it, circled the wagons. One distinguished academic claimed the author's research was old, out of date, selective and misleading. Well, I'd have to say 30 years on, there's not much support for his position. We now know, more graphically than ever if we look at it, what happens when family structures go wrong. But you say you rang this expert to ask what the research actually said, but when pressed, he wouldn't answer the question. Instead, he released a stream of invective, calling the author's mental faculties into question and asking emotionally, what do these people want? Do they want unhappy parents to stay together? He eventually admitted that the authors were actually correct as far as the research was concerned. But he asked rhetorically, where had that got anyone? Nowhere. Was it possible to turn back the clock? Of course not. And why were they so concerned about the rights of the child? What about the rights of the parents? What has happened that it's acceptable to ignore evidence when it impacts on others, particularly our own children?
Well, what that academic went on to not say, which I found out, was that he was divorced. And he was consumed, it seemed to me, by guilt about what he had done to his children. And what I found at that time was that for a variety of reasons, and we have to sort of think ourselves back to a time which was quite different from today, when, lifestyle choice hadn't really been properly invented. It was being invented. And what was happening was that these people who were responsible for producing apparently, ostensibly objective research were themselves caught up in these family dramas. They were themselves becoming divorced. They were themselves having children who were becoming divorced. And they couldn't bear the disconnect between the objective reality and their own family situation. So they made the objective reality fit their subjective feelings. They twisted it. And I watched this happen. And I watched academics who were committed to the truth get denied grant funding because they said things which were unsayable about family breakdown. And I found that there was an almost impossible task in elaborating upon these objective facts, this objective evidence, without immediately being accused of being horrible personally to people. I was set upon by people who said, "How dare you call into question what I have done, because I've done the best for my family. I've tried my best with my children." And I would say, "I didn't even know you were divorced." I'm not making any aspersions about individuals. Individuals cope the best they can with a variety of difficult circumstances. Many people who are divorced or who are bringing up children on their own do an absolutely magnificent job. They go to enormous and heroic efforts to protect their children. But nevertheless, it seems to me that these are situations of disadvantage. And isn't it better to try to avoid disadvantaging children wherever possible? In other words, we can't possibly entertain policy making which deliberately exposes children to disadvantage on the basis that it makes their parents happy, because we should surely put our children first. And when one's dealing with public policy, one has to deal with the reality as it affects the vast majority of people. That doesn't mean that you're not sympathetic to individuals going through these hard things. Well, those arguments went nowhere at all. The subjective ruled. My personal feelings trump the objective evidence. And this was part and parcel of something that I only realized after many years, that what was happening was not confined to this very emotional issue of the family, which clearly had emotional ramifications because people were personally bound up with this issue. What was happening was that the very idea of objective evidence was being cast aside because it was too inconvenient when it got in the way what people wanted, how they wanted to live their own lives. And as the years went on, it seemed to me that not only was evidence being cast aside, not only was apparently objective evidence by university researchers becoming subjective and warped and wrong and false, but the very idea of evidence was being overturned. The very idea of rationality and reason were being dismissed. And this was all part and parcel of what only appeared to me to be the case after many years, that on issue after issue after issue, family lifestyle choice, multiculturalism, deep green environmentalism, moral relativism, moral and cultural relativism, and all those isms, they were all ideologies. And the point about an ideology is that the idea is sacrosanct. Nothing can get in the way of the idea. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that all these ideologies were utopian. They were all predicated on a belief basically in the perfection of the world. So multiculturalism would eradicate prejudice from the human heart completely. It would stop war. It would stop conflict. Lifestyle choice would eradicate bigotry and the bigotry over differences in people's lifestyles. So no longer would people look down on people who were divorced or single parents and all that kind of thing. They were all utopian. Deep green environmentalism was about saving the planet from frying and being destroyed completely. So anyone who disagreed with these ideologies, anyone who said, well, actually the evidence shows this is wrong, factually wrong, that couldn't happen because the ideology couldn't be gainsaid. And because these ideologies were all to do with the perfection of the world, anyone who spoke against them was not simply wrong, they were evil. And it couldn't be said because it was such an evil thing. And so you found that evidence became politicized. It became called right-wing, ultra-right-wing, and all the rest of those epithets. And it became unsayable. And the people who dared to say it found themselves bullied and ostracized and persecuted and removed from their social, they lost their friends, they lost their professional advancement, they were threatened with their jobs, some of them lost their jobs, and so you have the situation we have today. And the reason I wrote that book, The Guardian Angel, was because what had happened to me in my professional life, when I started out, I worked for nearly 20 years for Guardian newspapers, the very heart of this liberal universalist ideological perspective. And what happened to me over that period was as I fell foul of that world very badly. But what happened to me seemed to me to illustrate what had happened to the West, what happened to Britain and to the West. And so through the story of what happened to me issue by issue, I could actually tell a bigger story of what happened to us in the West.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations,